Yes, that's me.
Question
No,
is,
but you're saying the children in the land of Canaan are innocent and they're being slaughtered.
no, I'm not. That's not what I'm saying right now.
You said that
What I'm
earlier.
saying is that I retracted the word innocent because
Okay.
I know it can be a bit tricky.
Okay. Let's suppose that tomorrow we find out that the pedophilia rings, that conspiracy theory is somehow true. Hackers just broadcast all the blackmail tapes, the Diddy files, the Epstein, whatever.
Right.
But
But I wouldn't kill their children.
no, right. Okay, so I'm getting there. So we'll get there step by step. Let's start with the men and the women.
Talking here
let's
about
get to the children.
military execution of
Okay, so then-
non-combatants, which is a war crime.
Pause. You've been voted out by the majority.
And yes, I am wearing the same shirt for continuity. Welcome everyone to my channel. I was on Jubilee for the debate, 1 atheist versus 25 Christians, and Alex O'Connor graced us with his presence. He's my favorite atheist, and the reason I'll tell you in a bit, but I'm gonna go into what I wanted to say and where I was going with some of my thoughts. And then I'm gonna make a longer version or a stream where I go through and react to everything in the entire video. So that's gonna be a long one. But for now, we're just gonna touch on what I intended or what I was aiming for in my responses. I'll make you guys a deal, by the way, and I give you my word that whatever thoughts I'm gonna share are going to be distinguished between two different kinds. We obviously know that hindsight is 2020. So because of that, I'm going to share the thoughts that I had already prepared beforehand and the thoughts that I was having live in the moment during this recording on that day when we recorded this in the studio. And so I'm going to give you my word that whatever I share is going to be the thoughts that I had already prepared. And if I share anything that is a reaction since this recorded and since this has been published, I will be clear about that as well. So, without further ado, having said that, let's begin.
My next claim is that God commands genocide in the Bible. I think that the two most problematic are in 1 Samuel 15, the destruction of Amalek, and in the book of Joshua, the destruction of Jericho and the destruction of Ai. King Saul is told to completely destroy the Amalekites, leave nothing alive that breathes, kill man and woman, child and infant, cattle and sheep. What I'm looking at here is, did God command the ethnic cleansing of the land of Israel from people like the Amalekites, people like Ai, people like Jericho? And I think the answer is clearly yes. The problem is that the Israelites are also sinful people. And when the Israelites are sinful, they get the prophet of God with literal stone tablets telling them how to correct their path. The Canaanites are sinful people, and when they're sinful people, they get the Israelites coming in and wiping them out of their own land. Hello.
Hi, Alex. Nice to meet you. So you pointed at several passages, but the prophets through and through condemn Israel in much harsher terms. And in fact, God dispersed them in much greater judgments because they were, and in fact, in Ezekiel it says that because you were supposed to be the light of the world, you are judged all the more strictly and are more responsible.
Okay, this is hilarious. I've gotten a lot of comments on this. If you've noticed, the reference that's put up on the lower third by the production team is a passage that at first when I saw it, I was like, oh, that's, maybe they're quoting some commentary or something. Come to find out, it's actually one of the texts that the Mormons use, which is so funny and ironic because this verse that is being quoted from the Mormon text is actually a quote from the Gospels, from the Gospel of Luke. So obviously everything I'm sharing now is a present thoughts that I'm having. But in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is the one who actually says this, and this is quoted in this text, in this Mormon text. But it's just strange that they not only quoted something that I wasn't referring to, although of course the principle is there, but they quoted the secondary source rather than the primary source, which is Jesus' own words in the Gospels, where this comes from. Instead, for some reason, they quoted a Mormon text, and I don't know why, but I'm sure I can give the editors a pass on that. They probably don't know the Bible. But anyway, I just thought that was hilarious.
So God was just with Israel.
Oh, so what text was I trying to refer to, which is in Ezekiel that I mentioned? And that would be Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel 16 is where it goes into the description of Israel and Judah as the sisters that became the whores of the nations, where he says, "Bear your disgrace, you also, for you have intervened on behalf of your sisters, because of your sins in which you acted more abominably than they. They are more in the right than you. So be ashamed you also and bear your disgrace, for you have made your sisters appear righteous." In other words, because of the greatness of your sin, O sister Judah, daughter Israel, you have atoned, you have made propitiation and turned my wrath away from the wickedness of the nations onto you. And so in an ironic sense, Israel, who was intended to be a sacrificial offering for the world, on behalf of the world and the sins of the world, though they were faithless, they still became a substitute for the world, not because of their righteousness in which they were able to intercede and mediate, but in their wickedness in which they absorbed the wrath of God on behalf of the nations. And by the way, I actually go into this in my devotional on the book of Ezekiel, which I'm just about to release. So if you're curious for more, check it out at deepthoughts.com. And so God places on them the primary responsibility. And this is a theme throughout the prophets, of course. And of course, some of my wording here is also a reference to Isaiah, where it says that you are a light to the nations.
In fact, he placed more of a burden and a mantle and a responsibility on them and judged them for it than he did the nations. And case in point, what's already brought up was the number of generations that passed before the Amalekites were judged and the Canaanites were judged.
Yeah.
But we can come back to that point.
Okay, but
So we never ended up coming back to that point, unfortunately. What I was aiming at there and implying there is the fact that with the generations that filled up the cup of wrath that had to do with the Canaanites, they were given 400 years worth of generation after generation after generation. If you were to divide that by 40, which is the number of a generation in the scriptures, then you end up with 10 generations. God gives them 10 generations worth of time to repent. And another point that Alex makes, well, why didn't God send to the nations a prophet like he did to Israel? And the unfortunate reality is that God sent many prophets to the nations like he did with Israel. And in fact, arguably even more witnesses to them than he did to Israel. And it's always confounded me and frustrated me to no end that the Christians he is discussing this with never bring this up. But we have in the beginning with Noah, we have God forming a covenant with all the nations through Noah. So all of the nations are in covenant with God, in their own covenant with God through Noah and under Noah. Noah's descendants make up the nations. Israel is then set apart through Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans, but the rest of the nations are in covenant with God, and whether they remained faithful to that covenant or not, based on the witness that was given to Noah and the law that was given to Noah and the revelation that was given to Noah, is what judges them. So that's the first prophet and the first witness that God provides. Not only Noah, by the way, but with Noah comes the entire story leading up to Noah, obviously, because Noah passed that down to the nations, which is why you see, by the way, in mythologies across the globe that are separated by oceans, the same motifs, the same themes, and the same origin stories, with differences, some more corrupted than others. Needless to say, that's the first witness, the first prophet. The next prophet that God provides is Abraham himself. Before his name is changed to Abraham, before he receives Isaac and receives his own nation, God sends him on a tour around the entire land, an entire region of the Fertile Crescent and the Mesopotamian lands. And from civilization to civilization, from tribe to tribe, Abram meets and bears witness to God. He goes from place to place, erecting altars and digging wells, and these become symbols, and he names them, and he makes these covenants in the eyes of the tribes and the peoples and the cities and the nations that he establishes these centers of worship in. And he is known by them, in fact, because we see later on that the Abimelechs and the pharaohs and the kings of those nations, they approach Abram during his circuit through the land, when he conquers the kings, when he rescues Sodom and Gomorrah, he rescues his nephew Lot, and so on and so forth. And all of his escapades, he becomes well known among all of the nations. They call him, like the Hittites call him, the Prince of God. Sodom, the king of Sodom himself is present when when Abram obviously rescues Sodom and Gomorrah and the other kings, the king of Sodom is present when Melchizedek forms the covenant with Abraham, which is the clearest witness of God Most High, who Melchizedek is a priest of, and Melchizedek establishes and foreshadows even the new covenant in his giving of bread and wine. And so you have the perpetual and universal priesthood in Melchizedek bearing witness in front of the king of Sodom. It says the king of Sodom is there present at the formation of that covenant. He's one of the witnesses. And so wherever Abraham goes, he's called a son of God, he's called a prophet of God, he's called a prince of God. He is recognized and known by the Hittites, the Philistines, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, and so on and so forth. So there's an entire circuit that Abraham makes throughout the land where he brings the revelation of God to everyone. Now, I had all of this prepared before this debate, and I was prepared to lay it out as I just did. Unfortunately, I did not take that route, which I probably should have, and we'll get to the part where I took a fork in the road that I regret a little bit. But this was the witness that God gave to the nations. Now, that's just the second witness. Okay, the third witness is when God delivered Israel out of Egypt and out of the hand of Pharaoh. It says even Rahab of the Canaanites, who was saved, by the way, and incorporated into the Messianic line, which shows you that it's not a genocide that God embarks on through his people Israel, but rather a judicial authority that he gives to judge the sins of the nations, not an ethnic cleansing. I'll come back to that point later and develop it. But my point here is Rahab herself says to the spies of Joshua, she says, when we heard of the plagues in Egypt, when we heard of the power of your God that delivered you out of Egypt, every man's heart failed him and melted like wax, and everyone and their courage fled from them. And so when we knew you were coming, every man was terrified. And this was supposed to be, just as the plagues were for Pharaoh, a witness of the power of God and a warning and an invitation to repent. In a moment's notice, if they had repented, God would have accepted them. And we know that because he did that with Rahab. Rahab the prostitute was saved because she decided to take her allegiance and give her allegiance to the God of Israel because of the witness that he gave to them. And the rest of the soldiers of Jericho, they decided to remain obdurate, they decided to remain rebellious, and they decided to resist. If they had repented, God would have delivered them immediately. In fact, he gave them 7 days of their marching around the city for them to repent. And by the seventh day, they had lost their opportunity and the walls came down at the trumpet call. So my point is, Rahab, who was saved, a Canaanite who was saved from, this is what I was going to bring up in a bit here, Rahab herself, who was saved from Canaan, not only was saved, but was incorporated into the Davidic line and the Messianic line. In other words, Rahab was the great-great-grandmother, a number of greats, grandmother. She was the grandmother of King David. So already you have the ethnic purity of the Israel seed line cut in half. You have it already divided and corrupted in half. If the issue here was ethnic purity and ethnic cleansing or genocide, you already have the ethnic line cut in half by the marriage of Rahab with, was it Nahor, I believe? I don't remember. And their descendant Boaz then marries Ruth, who is a Moabitess. She's from Moab, another Gentile. So now their children are only a quarter Israelite. So now you've corrupted the purity of the seed line, of the bloodline, twice. And now there's only a quarter of Israelite left. And she is the mother of, I believe, Jesse, who was the father of David, King David. She's the grandmother or great-grandmother of King David himself. And so King David, who is the Messianic king, he is the prototype of the Messiah, and he is the model and blueprint and example of the ultimate Israelite king. David himself is only a quarter Israelite, is only a quarter pure in the bloodline. He has two Gentiles incorporated into his bloodline, both of whom were saved out of the nations. And so this idea that there was any regard whatsoever to do with bloodline, seed line, or ethnicity is utterly foreign to the text. God is not concerned whatsoever with any of this. He is concerned with covenant. All that is passed on from God's favor to the people is only by means of covenant, and that's it. There is no other requisite. This is something I'll get to in just a second that I didn't get to share here. But all of this I had prepared before this debate, but didn't get the chance to share it. Perhaps if I had taken another fork in the road, I could have shared some of it, but unfortunately, I took a different road. We'll see right now.
Can I ask you then?
Yes.
How do you define genocide?
Right. If I may, I actually have a question I wanted to ask you.
You can tell my internal conflict here. I was deciding which fork in the road to take. And when I said, if I may, I'd like to ask you a question, the question is what comes up later. I bring it up later, which is the thought experiment that sent people reeling. We'll get to the thought experiment. And everyone's reaction to that. I'll tell you where I was going with that.
I think it's important to know what we're talking about.
I understand.
Right? What is a genocide?
Based on the word genome, obviously etymologically, we understand that you're taking it as a tribal seed line, which is fair.
It could be tribe, religion, ethnicity,
so I can understand.
And we're talking about the destruction or attempted destruction.
But here's the problem.
Or
here's
expulsion
right.
of people based on those characteristics.
So here's the
okay, we're talking about the expulsion or the destruction of these people based on these characteristics. This is what Alex just said, and my whole contention is that it's not based on those characteristics. It's based on their sin, and this is the point I go on to make here.
The problem. Genocide, especially the way it's used today, it implies that it's based on the race. Mm-hmm. And that is categorically against the command of God. Okay, so I cringe at myself here because I hate when people use the word categorically because it's overused. And it's one of those words that's been beaten to death. And I remember even in the moment when I said that, I was like, dang it, Randall, why did you say categorically? Like, I hate it when people use that word because it's overused. So I was cringing at myself at that point, but that's all right. To conquer the Canaanites. It had nothing to do with their race. It had to do with their sin.
And see, this is where I wish I had developed and honed in on this whole stream of consciousness I just delivered to you guys about Rahab and the seed line and how it demonstrates and proves that the Christ himself came from that bloodline which incorporated the Canaanites, the Moabites, and other Gentiles.
And in fact, this is...
So you know that when Amalek is attacked,
right.
Israel first warns another tribe that they're coming.
Yes.
And says, get out of here, because you were good to us when we came out of Egypt.
Right.
Amalek battled them when they came out of Egypt.
Yes.
He says to this other tribe, you guys get out of here. They warn them, right?
Right.
They don't say, hey, you get to stay here. They say, you've got to go,
yeah.
but we're going to warn you first that we don't totally destroy you.
That's right.
In other words,
absolutely.
It does seem to be, why is it that Israel are going into this land? The nation, why are they going into this land? Because it was the land promised to them by God. Why does it need to be...
Okay, so this objection that Alex brings up, he's implying how come these people were warned because they were good to Israel, whereas Amalek was not warned because they actually tried to fight Israel when they left Egypt. And this is exactly what I already answered, which I go on to answer, which is that it has to do with their sin. So the promise that God gave to Abraham is that those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. God does not bring about the blessings and cursings automatically. What he does is he bears witness to himself and he reveals himself to the nations. And then depending on their response or their reaction, then he will give them whatever they gave to him and his people. If they gave a curse, then he gives them back a curse. If they gave a blessing, he gives them back a blessing. And so that he gives opportunities ad nauseum, the Lord does, to the nations when they, as we see with Egypt, he gave to Pharaoh 10 opportunities to see that Pharaoh's gods were powerless and that God was the one who had protected and provided for Egypt this whole time. And by demonstrating his power over all of the elements and each of the areas of Egypt that had to do with their prosperity, God was revealing himself and manifesting and bearing witness to himself. And at any point, Pharaoh could have repented, but instead he hardened his heart, and so God hardened his heart in return.
Cleansed, because there are people in that land
Deuteronomy
who
chapter
aren't
7.
supposed to be there.
Deuteronomy chapter 7, chapter 9, he says, "Do not think that it is because of your righteousness or because of anything that has to do with you that I brought you into this land, but it was because of the sins of the nations that I gave it to you." This is Deuteronomy chapter 9.
The reason I brought up chapter 7 as well is because it's a related passage where God says, "I set my eye and my affection on you, and I loved you, and I chose you because I loved you." In other words, there was no reason, and he says, in fact, you were the smallest of all the nations. So, in other words, what he's saying is, you had nothing to offer me, and you were not a people that were suitable to my purposes or something like this. No, in fact, you had nothing to offer me. You were the smallest among the nations, but the reason I set my affection on you is because I set my affection on you. So in other words, it's an intentional tautology. It's a tautology of love. He's saying, I loved you because I loved you. Just as you might fall in love with someone and not know exactly why. You loved them because you loved them. This is a point, by the way, that Edmund Clowney makes very well, and he has since passed in the years since I heard him talk about this.
So it's not because he promised them based on some sort of ethnic requisite. In fact, the whole premise behind the destruction was the prototype of Sodom and Gomorrah.
So then a question.
So the prototype of Sodom and Gomorrah, which I clarify here.
Or deuterotype, because Noah was first.
A question which
So what I just said there, that you can't really make out, I said the prototype of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then I corrected myself. I said, actually, the deuterotype of Sodom and Gomorrah, because the prototype is actually Noah's flood. That's what I said right there.
A question which I think I know the answer to then. Do you think there was not one sort of good person?
No, exactly, and that's the point.
And if that's the case,
that's why I brought up Sodom.
Let me ask you a second question.
Well, hold on, let me answer your question a little bit more fully.
And what I was getting at is that the destruction of Canaan and the judgment of Canaan was already prefigured, and this is another witness. Sodom and Gomorrah established for the nations the conditions that God operates under in covenant with the nations, with the people of the earth. So everyone knew, because of the witness, this is another witness, again, a fourth witness here, for 400 years, everyone knew that Sodom and Gomorrah went up as a perpetual smoke and a perpetual fire because of their sin. And you have, back to Abraham, remember when Abram rescued Sodom and the kings that were allied with Sodom, when Abram establishes the covenant and the king of Sodom is there, the king of Sodom now is responsible for the revelation that he was just given and for the covenant that was just formed in his presence because of his deliverance from the five kings or the four kings that attacked him. And it's not 13 years later that Sodom is in the state it's in when it's destroyed. So the sin of Sodom took place, that corruption took place within 20 or 25 years. So between 13 and 25 years later is when Abraham argues with God about sparing Sodom and Gomorrah. They were oppressing the poor, the Sodomites. They were oppressing the poor. They were indulging in unnatural sexual perversion. They were subverting justice. And when Abraham made the agreement with God that for 10 righteous people he will spare the whole city, this was a blueprint and a model for the rest of the nations to understand that God doesn't need much. He only needs a mediator. He only needs a few. He only needs one family. One family. One family of 10 would have spared all the families of those cities. But none were found. And that's the point I'm making here, is that in the case of Canaan, it's exactly the same. And this is why it took 400 years for their sins to fill up, because no one was left that was righteous except for one, which was Rahab. She was the one who repented and was spared and was saved and was delivered. The rest were not. All of them could have gone the way of Rahab. All of them could have been saved, as we see clearly from Rahab herself and from the fact that any who throughout these conquests repented were spared and saved.
Were there any good people in Israel, in the nation of Israel?
Right. So let me answer your question.
Because if the
one.
answer is that there were bad people in Israel
Okay.
too,
So this goes back
why
to
is it that they don't get killed as well?
The slaughter of the children.
If it's not about
the
nation.
slaughter of the children has the same problem because it has to do with innocence. Okay. So let me address that problem.
Nobody's innocent. But my specific question is.
No, but you're saying the children in the land of Canaan are innocent and they're being slaughtered.
No, I'm not. That's not what I'm saying right now.
You said that
what I'm
earlier.
saying is that I retracted the word innocent because I know it can be a bit tricky.
Okay.
He already had admitted that the children were not necessarily innocent, which is actually very bold of him. Not just bold, but it's smart, because he knows that that's a weak point in the argument, because children, you can't automatically say that children are innocent. The issue of the children is not an issue of culpability, it's an issue of capability.
What I'm saying specifically here is that if the reason why Canaan is destroyed is because they're immoral, there's all kinds of immorality happening within the Israelite nation. Hold on.
Yes.
Happening within the Israelite nation as well. If it's not about nation, if it's not about tribe, then why is it that Israel aren't told to kill the immoral people in their tribe,
They are.
but only people in the other tribe?
No, they are. And in fact, that's what they do. And in fact, that entire generation that was promised the promised land died out without seeing the promised land because of their sin.
So this, I didn't go into this point. When I said they are and they do, I was referring to the law, which everywhere says that the evil must be expunged from among you. The evil must be purged among you. And the land must be cleansed of any wickedness, bloodshed, or the leaven must be purged, in other words. And this is why the Israelites were commanded to execute capital punishment, to stone those who were guilty of sins against the law of God. And so they were they were supposed to be just as judicial and just as just in their dealings with their countrymen as they were with the nations. And that's the whole point of the project of Israel. So that's one point.
In fact, that entire generation that was promised the promised land died out without seeing the promised land.
So the entire generation, the very generation that was pinpointed to receive the promised land, died without seeing the promised land because of their sin. Now, this is his objection here.
Because of their sin.
But not at the hands of the Israelites.
Not at the hands of the Israelites, which is half true, half false. It is at the hands of the Israelites, because Moses himself is the one who enacts the capital punishment against the idolatrous Israel when they worship the golden calf, and he melts the gold and forces them to drink it, and they die. So they have to be judged in the same way that they sinned. So God's judgment is always in accordance with the crime. The punishment fits the crime. The just penalty for that crime is that it is done likewise to them. And this is why Israel was commanded to do it this way. And we'll talk about in just a minute the sin of the Canaanites and why it was so heinous and why it demanded and required the judgment that sounds like genocide. Now, the other half, where he's right, that they were not killed at the hands of other Israelites, is because, again, the punishment must fit the crime. So, in the case of that generation that died out without seeing the promised land, it was because of their unbelief. So, just because, I mean, you talk about like being strict with the nation of Israel just as much as with the nations. God was far more lenient with the nations. He gave them 400 years. With Israel, he didn't even give them one generation and they died. Because of their unbelief, they had to make laps around the mountain, Mount Sinai, for 40 years in the desert and died off until that entire generation died off that way. And so the punishment fit the crime. Because of their unbelief, they said that this land is not something we can take. We will stay here. God says, fine, then you will stay here and you will die here. And this is where you will be. So in their case, they didn't need the capital punishment that was executed by Joshua's conquest. What they needed was to live in the unbelief that they had chosen and to live in the land that they had chosen by their unbelief. And it prevented them from entering the Sabbath rest that God had promised and entering and joining with God's own Sabbath enthronement and kingdom.
The Israelites are not told to expunge their own nation of the sin.
They are told many times, and I'll put the references on the screen.
Let me
by killing them.
Let me give you
and killing their
Let me give you
children
a thought
and killing their animals.
Sure.
Why kill the animals?
Let me give you a thought. Yeah. Perfect.
So why the animals? So here he's honing in on, okay, even if I were to justify the slaughter of the people, including the children and the infants, let's say there was a way to bypass that argument. Well, then why the cattle? Why the animals? Why the livestock? And this is an important point that Alex is focusing on. Why? Because you can surmise humans to be culpable for crimes, whether in terms of involvement or in terms of origin. And you can judge people for their crimes, and you can even find perhaps redemption in the suffering of people who undergo trials and sorrows. But why the animals? The animals have no exercise or agency in the volition of their will or the intention of their heart in terms of wickedness and righteousness. So why are the animals judged along with the people? This is perfectly answered by two things. The first is in Jonah. The counterpart of this is in Jonah. In Jonah, when God decides to show mercy and Jonah's upset about it, Jonah, he prophesies that the city will be overthrown, but they repent, and therefore God spares them. Jonah's upset because of a multitude of reasons we won't get into, but when God confronts him about his anger, and this is the way the book ends, God emphasizes one thing, and this is a very strange way for a book of the Bible to end. He says, okay, Jonah, you don't have compassion for this great city, this great people, who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? And the book ends. Now, why does the book end that way, and also much cattle? I've gone into the symbolism of that in another video, and you can go watch that if you'd like. But in this particular case, the reason I'm emphasizing this is God clearly has compassion not only on the people, but on the cattle. God is just as concerned for the cattle as he is for the people. If the people are spared, the cattle is spared. If the people are judged, the cattle are judged. Now, why? Why are those things linked? That brings me to my second thing that answers this challenge, which is the entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament, the temple system and the sacrificial system, is the answer to this question about animal suffering. Now, this is a point that Alex brings up in several places throughout this debate.
A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
And the Old Testament, ironically, not only shares Alex's revulsion at the idea of these animals, these innocent animals suffering unjustly, but it actually depends on that very fact to establish the necessary means for salvation through the sacrificial system and the system of substitution and atonement for sin. The Bible actually sees Alex's objection and raises him an even more amplified and evocative example, because he uses the example of the deer. Why does the deer in the forest have to suffer and die? The deer is a rhetorically powerful analogy, and it's a very emotionally evocative example, because the deer is helpless. The deer is a prey. The deer has little defense. The Bible actually amplifies this problem that Alex has with animal suffering even more than Alex himself, because it uses the image of the lamb. The lamb, which is the ultimate animal that is used in the sacrificial system, that the Bible is depending on to communicate the redemption of the entire creation through the ultimate lamb, which is Christ. That creature, the lamb, is even more helpless than the deer, and his plight is even more revolting, is even more emotionally distressing, because the lamb is more helpless than the deer. The lamb is raised in the household like a daughter, as it says in, for example, in Nathan's parable, where the lamb is raised in the household and is like a daughter to the household. And then the lamb is unjustly taken by the rich neighbor and slaughtered for his guest. And the parable of Nathan is intended to amplify this exact problem that Alex has, even more than Alex does. And it presents the exact same problem of injustice that Alex has. And so the entire Old Testament is based on this idea, which is why it has always confounded and frustrated me that Christians have never presented this as a response, even if it may not fully satisfy, at least it can get us somewhere, that to this response to Alex's objection. Because that's the entire basis of the covenantal and temple sacrificial system of substitution and atonement and sacrifice, is that the value of an animal's life is analogous to a human's life. It's not equal, obviously, but it has enough of an analogy to a human's life that it can be offered as a sacrificial atonement for sin temporarily. Of course, not ultimately, obviously. As we know from the book of Hebrews, Christ is the ultimate Lamb of God, the sacrifice that actually takes away sin. Whereas in the former covenant, in the Old Testament, the animal sacrifices simply covered sin temporarily, and it was simply a reminder of sin year after year. So this is the answer to the question. The slaughter of the animals and the cattle and the livestock in the cities that are devoted to destruction because of their sin and their judgment is a mirror, a black mirror, if you would, to borrow the excellent turn of phrase used by the producers of the show. It is meant and intended to be a black mirror of ourselves and of our own condition and of how wicked and heinous our sins are, that it brings about the innocent slaughter and the injustice of the death of all of this life, this creaturely animal life, this livestock and these animals. And so this is actually an issue that not only Alex has, but the Old Testament itself has and presents and amplifies even more. And I've repeated myself at this point, but you get the point. And so I'll talk about whether animal suffering is redemptive, which is one of his primary objections throughout this debate. I'll talk about that in the next video or in the next stream when I go into the entire debate and react to all of it. But suffice it to say, to begin, at least as a teaser, the sacrificial system and the temple system is the answer to animal suffering, because it depends on the value of the animal's life as an atonement for the life of man. And by being a substitute for the death and the judgment of mankind, it is enacting an image of Christ. It's fulfilling a figuration of Christ himself. And therefore, the animals are exalted to the highest possible function and purpose, which is to be a picture of Christ himself, which has a lot to say about how they will be rewarded and redeemed in the age to come. But that's a whole nother discussion that I'll go into in the next video or in the next stream, whichever I end up doing. But at least here, this is to begin to answer. And all of this, by the way, was something I had developed before this debate, and I was frustrated during this debate when nobody brought up the sacrificial system, which is the whole point of animal suffering.
Perfect. I'll give you a thought experiment. Let's suppose that tomorrow we find out that the pedophilia rings, that conspiracy theory is somehow true. Like, just imagine, like, V for Vendetta style. Like, imagine, like, hackers just broadcast everything that was going on, all the blackmail tapes, the Diddy files, the Epstein, whatever. Okay, you get the point. So you have this sudden revelation of this grand conspiracy, and it's on a scale that no one ever imagined.
Okay, so man, everyone lost their minds. Everyone lost their god-tang minds on this one. It cracked me up when I saw the reactions. I obviously wasn't aware. I mean, I knew that it was a spicy analogy, and I knew it was risky. But I'll tell you why it was exactly the effect I wanted it to have. Unfortunately, that effect meant that I was voted off, but it was the effect I was going for. And the effect is revulsion. The effect is disgust. The feeling that you get when you hear me expound on this analogy, the feeling of disgust, of revulsion, of why is he going there? Why is he talking about this? Like, this is just so tasteless and tactless, and that's the point. Because we don't understand how heinous the sins of the Canaanites were. If you actually read and study what they were doing in those nations in order to appease these gods, you would be far more horrified, disgusted, and shocked. The sin that is in view here that demanded the destruction is this. They would sell their children and give their children up to the temple prostitutes, both male and female prostitutes, to be abused, to be violated, to be sacrificed. So literally, the families of these nations would traffic their own children, their own flesh and blood, through the temple system of the false gods. And not only were they violated by the male and female prostitutes of those temples, but these children were also violated through bestiality. And there were specific gods such as Pan and others that demanded bestial relations as part of the sacrificial ritual. They would copulate with goats. They would copulate with other certain animals that were representations of those gods. And they had to pass their children through the fire, through the flames, and then they slaughtered and killed them after they had abused them. Some they dedicated to the service of the temple, and these children that were dedicated were either castrated, mutilated, or they became prostitutes themselves that eventually abused others. And so they were literally trafficked through these temple systems. So this is why I used this analogy, because it is the closest thing that we have today, this conspiracy theory, to what used to take place back then. Now, it doesn't matter whether that conspiracy theory is true or not. Obviously, the point of the analogy is to evoke the very reaction that you just saw everyone have, which unfortunately cost me the chair. However, that's the point. The point is that it is that disgusting. The sin of the nations was that disgusting. And that's just with the trafficking of children in the affairs of the temple and the sacrificial system of the false gods in those temples. That's not to even mention the oppression and the injustice and the perversion of the nations, regardless, like outside of that. They used to also, they would have these annual rituals where they would have these massive orgies where everyone in the family was required to participate, including the children and the infants, and it was a complete free-for-all. And I won't go into any more detail than that because I don't need to, and you get the point. This is the most vile of practices that was taking place generation after generation through this cycle of this temple cycle generationally for 400 years. And they had not only done that to each other, to themselves, to their own families, to their own flesh and blood, but they had done the same thing with other nations. They had captured and taken other nations, other tribes, other peoples, conquered them, and put them into that same system and trafficked them in the same way. And so when Israel is commanded to destroy and eradicate these peoples, it has to do with that practice. It's not an ethnic cleansing, it's a cultural cleansing. When I say cultural, it has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. Cultural, literally cult. The word cultural, etymologically, is what I mean by the word cultural. Classically, cultural means that it has to do with the temple cult system of that place, of that location, of that nation, city, what have you. So it was a cultural cleansing of the false practices and the wicked practices of the false gods, rather. And this is what it had to do with.
Okay, would you say that there is justice in bringing those people? Obviously, no one would disagree. In fact, the public opinion on execution might change at that point, and even the guillotine might come back. Who knows?
Right. But I wouldn't kill their children.
No, right. Okay, so I'm getting there. So we'll get there step by step. Let's start with the men and the women. So let's suppose in this example, the conspiracy theory is true, and everybody finds out, and then everybody agrees that the men and the women that were involved in this pedophilia ring, let's say, need to be judged. Okay. No, someone has to do it. We have no problem executing them. We have the benefit of technology that gives us a bit of indirectness. But if you didn't have that, you would have to either do it yourself or have your executioner do it.
I'm basically addressing the issue here in stages, because you have to break it down into stages. So my point there had to do not with his objection about the innocent children or about the non-combatants. That specific point had to do with why is Israel given the authority and the permission and the command, meaning like why are human beings given the command to execute the judgment? Why doesn't, for example, someone might say, why doesn't God just execute that judgment himself? Now, this is a much bigger question, but my point is that someone has to execute judgment at some level when there is wickedness that is exposed. And if it was in the modern day with this example I'm using of the pedophilia rings, then somebody has to execute that judgment. By someone's hand, it has to be done. And so that person is not guilty or culpable just because he is the hand that executes the judgment. Now, a much deeper layer to this is the fact that now what is the question of why is Israel specifically being given that authority? And this has to do with the entire project of Israel from beginning to end. It's a meta-narrative answer, because the whole point of raising up Israel, giving them the law, and having them mature from a nomadic tribal people into a kingdom, and then eventually into a prophetic people that are dispersed through the nations. The whole point of that entire trajectory, that entire project of Israel, from beginning to end, is to bring about the maturation of man into the image of God. In other words, we had lost the representation and the power and the authority that we were initially intended to have to act on God's behalf. And to be given authority to act on God's behalf is a matter of wisdom and maturation. And you don't give authority to someone who isn't psychologically able to handle it, right? Judicial authority is something that God intends to give to man eventually, when he matures into kingship, when he matures in the wisdom of God through obedience and in the formation of the instruction of wisdom, which is the command and the law of God. They have now been entrusted with authority, and in fact, they're given the authority of capital punishment. This is what is given to Noah. So Adam and Eve don't have that authority. But then when God renews the world through the flood and then gives it to Noah, Noah now has the authority to execute judgment, capital punishment, because he has brought about the maturation of mankind from childhood to adulthood, from servanthood to kingship, from priesthood to kingship. You see this progression in Israel's history as well. They begin as a priesthood, they mature into a kingdom, and then they mature further still into a prophetic witness, a prophetic people with the prophets, and even the canon of scripture reflects that. Now, the point here is that God's entire purpose in his formation of Israel is to train them in his law, and then eventually for them to mature, to have the judicial authority and the wisdom and the maturity to handle that kingship. And so by giving them the conquest of the land against these wicked people, once the measure of their sins has filled up, he is training the Israelites for that kingship. He is training them to have the authority as images of God and to be restored as images of God, to be like God, and to be given the authority as Noah was of capital punishment, of executing judgment. So this is the whole point, is for man to eventually mature into kingship so that he may share his rule. And this is what Christ ultimately accomplishes. Christ humbles himself, becomes obedient to death, and then obtains an exaltation that is above every other name, and obtains a kingdom that is above every other kingdom. And then through him, we are seated in heavenly places with him in the council of God. We are raised up and given that authority that he won for us and this is how we exercise that authority, through prayer. But that's a whole nother topic. Suffice to say, this is the reason why God gave the command for Joshua and the Israelites to execute this judgment, because they have to learn kingship, they have to learn how to exercise authority and how to judge sin.
Talking here about military execution of non-combatants, which is a war crime.
Right. So no, it's a war crime according to, yeah. But
So I faltered here clearly, and this is a bit of an unfortunate moment for me. But I faltered here because I was trying to get my thought out, and I was too fixated on it, and then he threw me off because I hadn't really listened to and comprehended what he had said, in time to respond properly. But at that point, I was already out. So.
Okay, pause.
Besides,
you've been voted out by the majority.
That's somewhere I was going. That's okay.
So where was I going with this analogy? So let's complete the analogy and where I was going to go with this. Okay. So I was taking this in stages. So the first stage has to do with the execution of men and women. So the issue here is not that they are non-combatants, as he says. The issue here is that they are complicit in this sex trafficking of their own children, of other nations, and of their own families, and of themselves, through this vile sacrificial temple system. They are all complicit in this thing. All the adults are complicit. They are all enforcing these annual rituals, these orgies, these wicked practices, and passing their children through the fire, selling them into the temple system to be abused and violated, and even sodomized and bestialized. And so you have this whole system taking place. And then these men and women that were slaughtered, including the elders, are all complicit. This is what the children were also participating in those nations, in the Canaanite nations. The children themselves were commanded and expected to become of age through the use of this exact type of training and violence, bloodshed, and death. And so they have all been generationally involved in this system. And so all of them are receiving the judgment from the judge. It's so the picture here is not so much two nations that are equally culpable or equally just or equally devoted to a cause, battling against each other. It's not anything like that. This is the situation here that the Bible presents, is that it's a courtroom and a jury and a judge. And these are now criminals that have finally been arrested and brought to trial, and they have been given many chances to leave off their crimes and to repent, and haven't. And now the day of judgment has come, and they must be judged, and they must be executed. And so this is the picture that is being given, which is why Rahab even says, every man's heart melted and their courage fled from them. And it's because they knew that the God that leveled the most powerful civilization on earth, which is Egypt, that God was the one who sent this nation to cleanse the land of the wickedness. And so they knew, but they were not willing to repent. And this is the situation that's happening. So this is not non-combatants. These are all people who are complicit in this wicked practice. Now, the next stage of the problem here is, okay, fine, the men and the women, fine. They're all culpable, fine. What about the children, let's say? This is what I would say. And actually, this is what I actually said, which was cut out. So this is actually something that they cut out of the end of my time here, which is fair. I actually agree with the edit there. But what I said to Alex at that point, when he said, what about the children? I said to him, okay, let me ask you something. Do you support the woman's reproductive right to terminate her pregnancy if she desires? Do you support the right to abortion? This was the question I was posing to him, and I did pose it to him. And he was very smart because he knew that I was trying to trap him. And so what he said was, and again, this was cut out, but what he said was, I'm agnostic on that point. And so that would have been tricky to navigate, but I was expecting him, and I would expect like a detractor of Christianity, for example, to say, yes, of course I support the reproductive rights of women over their bodies and over their pregnancies, and the right to either support the life, the developing fetus in their womb, or to withdraw their support of the fetus, to terminate the pregnancy, right? So then I would have said, okay, all right, so you give to the woman the right to support the developing life in their body, the fetus, the life of the fetus, to support the fetus, or to withdraw support from the fetus, to withdraw the support of that life. You give to the woman that right, which of course I would say is a divine right, not a human right. But you grant it to the woman, but you won't even give to God the merely human right. According to you, this is a merely human right. You won't even give that right to God to support or to withdraw support of the life in his womb, which is the world. The world is the womb of God. The scripture says this everywhere, which I'll get into in just a second. And you won't even give to God that merely human right to support or to withdraw support of the life, the developing life in his womb, which is the world, the earth. Now, someone might object and say, well, that's awfully clever, that's awfully poetic, that's awfully rhetorically, sneaky of you. But you can't really it's not, it's a false, someone might say that's a false equivalence. The scripture doesn't really talk about it that way. I mean, that's not really how it, and I would object and say, yes, it does. It does in no uncertain terms, in fact. You see in the very beginning that the world is brooded over by the Spirit like a mother hen. And it says even in Psalm 110 that in the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. Though in the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. You have Psalm 19, where it says that the bridegroom, the son emerges like a bridegroom coming out of his tabernacle. The tabernacle, it says, is the firmament. And then it says in Psalm 19 that the son emerges out of his chamber, the bridal chamber, like a bridegroom, and the earth is the bride. And the earth is therefore the womb in which the sun shines, and the giving of that light is the conception of life on the earth, in the womb of creation. You see this also in Psalm 139, probably the clearest example in the Old Testament, which is where it says that I was formed in my mother's womb, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. So the depths of the earth corresponds to the womb, because the depths of the earth and the earth is the womb of God in which He knits together our form. And finally, the most obvious example is Romans 8, where you have the entire creation groaning in the pains of childbirth, awaiting the revelation of the sons of God. In other words, creation is in the labor pains, giving birth to the children of God, and the entire life cycle of every creature is characterized as a pregnancy and a developing fetus, and then once we die, we finally are born into the real world. So this is a lot like the Matrix. In fact, in the Matrix, when Neo first wakes up, you'll notice he's in a fluid, a sort of primordial fluid, and then he has an umbilical cord. The umbilical cord is detached, and then he's sent out through the chute, and that chute is a birth canal. It's symbolic of a birth canal. So Neo is being born from the Matrix into the real world. That's the symbolism there. Anyway, and so this is how I would shore up the argument about, well, God has the right. The Lord is pregnant. The world is his womb, and the Lord is pregnant with all of us, and He chooses to support our developing life or to withdraw that support. And when He withdraws that support, He's not killing us like we do when we withdraw support from the womb in a mother. When He withdraws support, He's giving birth to us and receiving us back into Himself. So if God chooses to end and terminate the pregnancy early, He's not doing so through death, He's doing so through life. He's actually giving birth to that person into the eternal and into the divine and into the metaphysical and into His own life. And this life is now brought back into the bosom of God. And so there should be no objection here, especially from detractors that might be in support of abortion. Then you're being a hypocrite if you will grant that right to the mother, to the human, but you won't even grant that human right, according to you, to God. You won't even give Him that right. Of course, I would say that is not a human right. It is only a divine right. Only God can give and take back life. In fact, in Psalm 104, and this is the next passage that connects to this, in Psalm 104, the way it describes this is very, very telling, the way it frames it. In Psalm 104, it says that God gives His breath and we are created and come to life. And then it says that He withdraws His breath and then we die and return to the dust. So the idea in the scripture is that God is simply breathing out and then breathing in. All He does is He takes a breath, He gives His breath, and then He takes it back. So when God gives His breath, that's what gives us life. Who are we to say, I'm going to keep this breath for myself and do my own thing with it, and F you, God, like, I don't care about you. He withdraws his breath, and when he withdraws his breath, he doesn't just return us to the dust, he returns our own spirit, which is the breath, to his breath, to his spirit. He rejoins and reunites our spirit with his spirit, our breath with his breath. So when we bring about death in this world, or when we terminate pregnancy, or when we have no power after that to return to that life something better. We have no power, and we don't know where that life goes. We have no power to transport that life somewhere else. It's just too bad that the mother didn't want the developing fetus, didn't want the child, and terminated it. Or it's just too bad that we murdered and killed and whatever. But when God withdraws his breath, when he brings about death, it's not the way we do. He is simply returning that breath that he gave back into himself, into his own lungs, into his own self. And so that breath, that spirit that animates us, returns to the origin and the source and the fountainhead from which we sprung, and is therefore reunited with our eternal life. And so why would we fault God for returning us back into himself, especially when it comes to children? And this is something that comes up later in the debate, where he says, well, then we should rejoice if children die of leukemia because they're being... Well, no, of course not. That's silly, because the entire purpose of giving us life on the earth is so that we may live unto him. Now, if we are overtaken by the corruption that our sin has caused, if we're overtaken by disease and death, which is a consequence of our sin, then we should weep for the injustice and the death that we brought. But we can rejoice that God is just to give and redeem and restore back to that premature life, the fullness of the life that it never lived. And this is what God does in the age to come, and in the judgment day, and even in the time awaiting that day. And so in every case, God is just. And this is the closest that I had reached to answering this objection and to completing this thought experiment. And this is what I had prepared. Everything I just shared, everything I've shared, is what I had prepared beforehand. But of course, there was no occasion, obviously. So, that's so much for my first appearance. Wait a minute, was that my second appearance? Okay, so much for my first appearance. Now, let's go to my second appearance.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Okay, so historical case for the resurrection.
Well, before we get there, actually, my main contention had to do with the example that was just brought up about the flight to Egypt.
I mean, we can talk about it, but what I really want to know here is how we know that the resurrection of Jesus historically happened.
Right, okay.
So can I start with the question for you, for example? Do you believe that the graves opened and that the holy ones were walking around the city of Jerusalem, appearing to many people?
Yes.
Why is this not reported in any other gospel?
Okay. I'll go into this in the next video or in the stream when I go through everyone's debate performance, and I'll react to it. The reason I was so eager to jump in here is because it was indescribably frustrating that the academics that were debating him before I came up were unwilling to defend the historicity of the graves opening up as reported by Matthew. And Alex is very smart. He knows that Christians are divided on this issue, which he brings up later. And that's why he hones in on this example, because it seems fantastical, and it's very easy to feel embarrassed by that pericope, by that story, if you don't have a solid conviction about the historicity of the report. And so he knows this, and that's why he uses it as an example of the fact that the gospel reporters cannot be trusted. So.
Gospels, any other historical account anywhere, given that this is the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened in human history.
Right. So
Okay, he says it's the most extraordinary thing. It's not the most extraordinary thing that happened in human history. It may seem like that to us, but obviously the most extraordinary thing would be the resurrection of Christ in a glorified body unto exaltation. And the graves opening up would be simply a proleptic consequence of Jesus breaking the power of death on the cross. And so I say proleptic because the graves opened up before Christ himself was raised.
Also, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt,
please.
but also crucially, Matthew says, at the time of Jesus' death, there was a huge earthquake, the second earthquake, the graves opened, and that then the holy ones appeared to people after the resurrection to many. So there's this very, very strange passage, which seems strange on the surface, but also says that the graves opened at the time of the crucifixion, but they weren't walking around and appearing to people until after the resurrection. It seems confused, it seems contrived, unless they were like hanging out dead in open graves for like 3 days until they got up or something. It's a very, very strange passage.
Okay, so this is a bit surprising on Alex's part, because Alex is usually an extremely incisive and salubrious thinker. However, here he's indulging in a little bit of, I would say, he's cavilling a bit. He's being a little bit petty with his objections. And this is easily demonstrated by simply reading the passage. So the thoughts I'm sharing now at this stage here are obviously new thoughts that I'm adding to what I had in the moment. But here in Matthew 27, we have the passage after the temple curtain was torn in two. Jesus cried out, yielded up his spirit. The rocks were split. The earth shook. And the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Okay, obviously this is an issue of modifier that has been placed in a clause that can easily be read in two different ways. I mean, it's a bit surprising that Alex is unwilling to overlook his over-scrupulous sort of exactitude in his reading here, because obviously when it says the many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, that modifier after his resurrection doesn't have to just apply. This is so silly that I'm even going through this. It doesn't have to just apply to them coming out of the tombs. It can either apply both to coming out of the tombs and being raised up, or it can apply to everything, all the way up to the tombs being opened. All of it is in one sort of sequence. And so that modifier after his resurrection can apply to all of them. It can apply to 2 of them, 1 of them, 3 of them. I mean, whatever reading makes the most sense, because that clause, even in the Greek, it's not exactly antecedent with the referent that comes before. After his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. It could apply just as easily to the next clause. So the objection he's making here, honestly, is he's just cavilling, and I'm a bit surprised because his reading is usually sharp when it comes to these texts. But anyway, it's a bit silly that I even had to go through that exercise, because it's very easily resolved by just a grain of standard reading comprehension.
Which I think has no historicity behind it.
Sure, but that's not the same as the claim you originally brought up, which is the resurrection of Christ himself.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is if that's unlikely...
So if I were to, I understand. So if I were to connect the two, what I would say is the historicity...
So here's what I'm doing. I'm actually turning his argument on its head. Because what I just interrupted him saying, what he was about to say just then, he's saying if it's unlikely that this report of the resurrection of the saints, which was an eyewitness report, if it's unlikely that this took place simply because it sounds fantastical and there's no other depiction of it in the other Gospels and so on, everything he just said, he's using that to therefore recharacterize the quality of the reports and the eyewitness testimony and the data and the evidence that we do have of the resurrection, regardless of whether it's given multiple attestations. And so that's, I think, the move he's trying to make. And so what I'm doing is I'm turning it on its head here.
Christ has the same type of data that the historicity of the resurrection of these holy ones in Matthew, because the appearances of these holy ones and the appearances of Christ correlate. They correspond. And so the reports of their appearances is just as likely, like for example, you're aware of the passage in 1 obviously Corinthians 15, which is one of the earliest attestations of the the formal traditional creed that states about the resurrection of Christ and the appearance to 500.
In 1 Corinthians 15, I am delivering to you that which I received, that Christ died according to the Scriptures, was raised according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to, Cephas, and then James, and then so on, and then 500, and then finally me as one untimely born.
And this states within 5 years of Christ's resurrection. So,
well, arguably, yeah. I mean,
right,
it's unclear. I mean, are you referencing...
As I understand, you do grant that possibility.
I grant that Paul's very early. I don't know about 5 years.
Sure. But, well, the tradition on which it's based, because he's quoting a very specific midrashic formula.
But, I agree.
Okay,
but
I can concede that.
Paul inserts himself into that formula. He says, finally, he appeared to me. So at some point, the formula stops and Paul's own words
actually,
began.
that demonstrates the proof of the formula rather than subverts it.
Sure, but I don't know where the formula ends.
So what he's saying, what I'm saying is that this is a well-known midrashic formula that it demonstrates evidence of being formed within 5 years of Jesus' resurrection, which is not necessarily a point I would even it's not a hill I would die on. I don't need it to be within 5 years. That doesn't really matter. The only reason I brought it up is because Alex himself brings that up in another debate that I had watched before this. So all of this that I'm sharing now were thoughts that I had in the moment and before this recording. And so I had studied Alex O'Connor enough to know, no, he does grant that. He does grant that reading. And he himself even says that it's, I was even surprised that Alex was willing to grant that dating of the formula. I myself wouldn't even necessarily feel the need to give it that date. So my point here, though, is that, and then here he says, well, Paul inserts himself into the formula at some point. And I was surprised because that was like a very easy softball that he was giving me, because by saying that, you're implying that the formula stands. Like the fact that he has to break the formula and that it's pretty obvious where he breaks the formula because he inserts himself, even though he tries to say right after my retort, well, it's unclear, where it ends or where it begins. He's at that point he's quibbling. I don't think he has conviction behind even himself what he's saying there. But I was very glad that I was able to recognize immediately that his objection of the formula breaking is actually something that establishes the formula rather than subverts it, as I already said.
Okay,
and Paul begins.
That's fine. My point is to say that there are early attestations that are no different in nature than the attestations of the holy ones that rose from the grave.
So again, appearances that were observed and reported, eyewitness testimony for the one, appearances that were observed and reported, eyewitness testimony for the other. So the type of data that establishes one establishes the other. So that's the point I'm making.
So crucially,
so if you reject the resurrection of Christ based on the data of eyewitness testimony, then of course you're going to reject the resurrection or the resuscitation, let's say, either one of the holy ones based on the eyewitness testimony.
Well, it's fine if you believe that. I just said
that is of the same nature. That's what I said here, where he talked over me, because it's of the same. That is of the same nature. So of course it is of the same nature. You're trying to break one using the other, but in fact, the one upholds the other. And so if you're not going to accept the one, which is more foundational, then of course you're not going to accept the other, which is more derivative.
I know that a lot of Christians don't, so I'd like to establish that first. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. Let's forget it.
So he says, I just wanted to establish that you do defend the historicity of this report about the saints rising from the graves, and he says, okay, great. Then in that case, it's irrelevant.
So we did your passage. Can we do mine?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We can pick it up.
So the reason why I was so fixated on returning to the flight to Egypt issue, it'll make sense if you watch the debate leading up to this point, because he tries to use that as that discrepancy as a contradiction of the reports of Jesus' early childhood.
Luke says that the family go to the temple and present Jesus in Jerusalem. Matthew says that they go to Egypt. They're very far away from each other. And we're told that they stay in Egypt until after the death of Herod. This is a contradiction.
So again, I actually agree.
Okay, pause.
And so this is what I'm trying to do. This is why I'm not here focusing on the resurrection of Christ and the evidence for his resurrection per se, because I was simply wanting to come in and contribute as a footnote on an issue that was being brought up repeatedly that is easily solved. And so I just wanted to present that information.
Forget about the graves opening thing.
Sounds good. So let's go to Hosea,
sure.
if you don't mind. So in Hosea, you have actually a fantastic example of how the prophecies of Christ are being fulfilled at deeper, multivalent levels, right? It's a metalepsis of prophetic fulfillment. So
let me explain what I mean by that. These are a lot of complicated words. So when I talk about the multivalence of meaning, it just simply means multiple meanings in one passage, which is the Hosea prophecy that is quoted in Matthew, out of Egypt I called my son. It has many dimensions or layers of meaning to it. There's depths to it. This is what multivalence means. And then the sort of sister term that I used right after that, it's a metalepsis of prophetic interpretation, is conveying basically the same thing. A metalepsis is a multidimensional sort of compacted seed of truth that branches out into this great tree of other references in a literary text. And so this is the point I'm making, is that the prophetic interpretation that is employed by Matthew in using Hosea is actually has layers of depth that resolve not only the contradiction that it appears to present intrinsic in the passage itself, which wasn't brought up, by the way, but it also resolves the contradiction that he seems to discern when you compare it to Luke's account. And so I didn't obviously get into the layers because I knew I wouldn't have time. And I can get into that in the next stream if you guys want me to. There's so many layers of depth to that prophecy. And in fact, the very fact that prophecy appears to be poorly utilized is the very door through which, and the key and the lock through which opens up the multivalence of meaning and the many layers of depth that the passage provides, because the way that the authors are using the prophetic passage is not the way we would expect. It's not like some sort of Nostradamus application of a prophecy the way we think. That's a whole nother topic that would take a long time, so I'm going to save that. But I would invite you guys to come to the stream or to join in the next video where I can get into that in detail if you guys want me to. Just to tease it so you understand what's at stake here, when Matthew quotes Hosea, he says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." First of all, the first problem with that is that he quotes it in reference to Jesus fleeing from Judah into Egypt. He's not applying it or associating it with Jesus leaving Egypt, which happens later on in the passage. No. This is a mistake that some commentators and readers will make, is that, well, they just assume, oh, he must be talking about like later in the passage when he ends up leaving Egypt and going back. Out of Egypt I called my son. That's not what Matthew's doing. Matthew is intentionally inverting the locations of the prophecy. And so when it says, out of Egypt I called my son, he's actually referring to his departure from Judah into Egypt. There's an irony at play here. The author, Matthew, is intentionally being ironic. So we'll get into that in the next stream. But the second problem you have is, if you go back to Hosea and read the prophecy that Jesus is supposedly fulfilling, you look high and low for some messianic reference. It's not. The context of the original prophecy in Hosea seems to have no relevance to. It seems to just be a sort of a piecemeal application at a very rudimentary surface level. That it's like, really, like, this is supposed to be convincing, like, because in Hosea, it's talking about the fact that God delivered Israel out of Egypt originally through Moses, and it's referring back to that event. Out of Egypt I called my son being Israel. Now, of course, if you know the story of Israel's flight from Egypt very well, then you're able to correlate, oh, of course, the Israelites, they had their infants slaughtered by Pharaoh. And now Herod is slaughtering the infants of Judah. And just as Moses fled and escaped from the slaughter of the infants that Pharaoh enacted in Egypt, so Jesus, as a new Moses, is fleeing from the slaughter of the infants by King Herod in Judah. So that's one correlation. But I'll go into how reading it, not at the surface level, but reading it at the multivalent level, answers the contradiction within the passage itself, and it answers the contradiction that seems to appear in Luke, and so, which is his contention here, Alex. Now, this is actually something that I had mentioned to Alex that they cut out. At the end of my time here, I actually said to him, because he brings up the contradictions in the Bible, and I said to him, actually, Alex, if you end up picking me for the 10 minutes at the end, my claim is that the contradictions in the Bible are intentionally placed there as riddles that are intended to borrow James Jordan's phrase, stimulate deeper reflection. And by doing so when you encounter a contradiction, it's a filter. If you don't have ears to hear, if your heart is bad, then you're going to scoff and walk away, which is why Jesus spoke in parables, and why people scoffed at his method of teaching and his riddles, which were paradoxical and made no sense and contradicted themselves. Jesus intentionally contradicted himself in several places, and I'll go into that as well in the next stream. But I had this all prepared in case he called me up for the last 10 minutes. This is what I was going to talk about, is how the contradictions in Scripture are intentionally placed there as riddles and paradoxes to stimulate and provoke deeper reflection. And so if we have good hearts, if we have ears to hear, when we encounter the difficulty and the challenge of a contradiction, we should meditate on it. And by meditating on the difficulty, we actually end up reaching a far deeper truth than if the contradiction was never there. So I'll go into that in the next stream if you guys want me to.
First of all, you have the time of the purification rite for the mother. It lasts 33 days after the circumcision of the infant. And therefore, it's a 40-day period before they're presented at the temple. This takes place before they flee to Egypt. Now, I understand the difficulty in the verse right after Luke's pericope about the presentation of the temple with Zechariah, because it says that they returned to Nazareth.
Yes, he says that afterwards they returned to Nazareth.
I understand.
Maybe they went to Egypt in between.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Can I just say that that may be the case? I think that's an unnatural reading of the case, but I'll just grant you for a moment. Let's say that the birth narrative...
It's not clear to me why that would be an unnatural reading, to be honest, but so be it.
Narratives don't contradict each other, that's fine. Let's say that the birth narratives are not historically unreliable for that reason. Evidence of the resurrection I'm looking for right now.
Sure, I understand that.
But I get where you want to address it. But there are contradictions in the Gospels.
Okay.
Well, that's a whole nother claim.
I'm so sorry. You've been voted out by the majority.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, appreciate
it. And there you have it, folks. I have way more thoughts on this debate. I will share one thing right now, which is on the third claim that had to do with Jesus. Jesus never claimed to be God.
My next assertion is that Jesus never claimed to be God.
I was tormented sitting in my chair, unable to address this claim, and tormented also by the fact that almost none of the Christians that went up were able to provide a direct answer to his question, like an actual reference where Jesus himself is claiming to be God, and ideally outside of the Gospel of John, which is a quality that Alex was looking for. And so we'll get into that when I do the stream. And there was one or two brothers that did well by bringing up the quote from Daniel about the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power, and how he claims this about himself at his trial in the Gospel of Mark. So that was the closest that we came to it. And there was one other, I believe, reference to Jesus walking on the water, which was also a good reference. And I might be misremembering that, but I'll get into that in the stream live with you guys. But I'll just give you a teaser now. And this is what I had prepared. And I tried to get to the chair and I couldn't, but this is what I would have brought to that claim. I didn't get to speak at that claim. In Matthew 18, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Everyone knows this passage. And it goes through the process by which a dispute between brothers can be resolved, right? Maybe I'll read it in just a second, but at the end of the passage, the famous verse comes up. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. So that famous verse, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am, it's specifically in context referring to when the people of God, the community of Christ, are gathered for judgment to execute and resolve a dispute between brothers. Right? When that takes place, there I am in their midst when they assemble in my name. When there are the 2 or 3 witnesses that are necessary. As it says in the law, everything is established on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so Jesus is saying that when 2 or 3 are gathered, when those 2 or 3 witnesses are gathered and you are resolving a dispute, there I am in your midst. Now, here's the kicker. This entire sequence and that reference comes from the Torah. It comes from the Pentateuch. In the book of Numbers, in both the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, in fact, you have a development where God establishes the order of resolution and a sort of a court case and the necessary steps and sequence that Israelites need to undertake if there's a dispute between 2 brothers, and they bring it before the elders, and it's a court case situation, basically, and then they pass judgment on the matter. And it follows the same sequence that Jesus presents. In Numbers 35, this is what we read. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So again, he's describing the court trial by which the elders discern and judge and purge the evil among them. So, you shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell. For I, the Lord, the name, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. So in the context of the lawsuit and the court case, concerning the one who is guilty, not only is the principle of 2 or 3 witnesses repeated by Christ, but the sequence as well, where the murderer is brought to trial before the elders, then before also the priests and the judges, so now the whole assembly, and if they inquire and find him guilty, then he is to be judged. And the conclusion of that passage in Numbers is this: you shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. And that concludes this passage, which is the same way Jesus concluded his passage by saying, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in your midst. So here he says, I, the Lord, Yahweh, the name, dwell in your midst. For you are gathered in my name, and pass judgment concerning this matter in order to cleanse the land. And I am in your midst, and I dwell in your midst, and I am the Lord, the name, Yahweh. Jesus is repeating and transforming the very same thing when he says in Matthew, for when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name and agree concerning anything on earth, and in context he's talking about lawsuit, covenant, court case disputes between brothers on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses before the elders in the assembly, just as it is in the passage concerning Israel. And he ends it the same exact way. He says, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in your midst. So Jesus is claiming to be the name, the Lord, in these passages, and not only to be the very same Lord, but to have the authority to transform the command from one of capital punishment to one of excommunication. And he says even that he is present in their midst, in the same way that the Lord is present in the midst of Israel. And so Jesus is making a claim not only to a sort of omnipresence, which is that's an incidental point. The point here is that Jesus is claiming the name for himself. He's saying, in my name, which is, what is his name? Jesus. Yahweh saves, right? So the name of Yahweh is in his name. And he is appropriating onto himself the passage that specifically names the name of God, Yahweh, as the one who dwells in the midst of the people when 2 or 3 are gathered. This is what Jesus repeats. He himself is claiming to be the one that is in the midst of Israel, the one that made this command and that gave this promise. This is the way that Jesus. Now, Alex might object to say, well, why is Jesus? If this is the case, why is Jesus communicating his deity in such an obscure way? And I would say it's not obscure at all. It's only obscure because we don't know the scriptures. Like, imagine if you're an Israelite listening to him say this, and you hear the echo of the passage, and he replaces Yahweh with himself, his name with his name, and he says that he is the one in the midst, and that the 2 or 3 witnesses are passing judgment on his behalf, in the same way that the Lord said about the elders in Deuteronomy and in Numbers. So people would have instantly thought of this and been a bit obviously taken aback by the claim that Jesus is making. Now, I have a lot more objections to some of the arguments of Alex about this point that I wish the brothers that brought up some good passages had been able to defend, such as the fact that when Jesus says ego eimi, I am, Alex tries to make the point, it could just mean, it could just mean it's me. But it all depends on the context. And obviously, if Jesus is saying before Abraham was, I am, it wouldn't make sense for him to say before Abraham was, it is me. Like, what? No, he's saying before Abraham was, I am, ego eimi, the same construction in the Septuagint for the name of God, which is why the Pharisees knew what he was saying and picked up stones to stone him. So I wish that point could have been, stressed more fully. But of course, that comes from the Gospel of John. Now, there's another passage, which is the one about him walking on the water, which relates to prophecies about God himself who tramples on the waves of the sea from the book of Psalms and from the book of Job. And so I'll get into all of that in detail. And if he were to ask, well, why is Jesus still not saying it directly? I would say, well, because he's wise. Like, he says over and over that it's the same reason he teaches in parables and in riddles. The disciples asked him, why do you teach in parables? Jesus says, to hide the truth, so that seeing they may not see. So, of course, Jesus' entire MO is to hide the truth, to conceal it for those who are willing to dig and find the buried treasure through the exercise of meditation, to be rewarded by seeking diligently and finding. And that those who are not worthy, who do not have ears to hear, will be bypassed or will be judged for their hardness of heart and their uncircumcised ears. And so this is the whole point of Jesus' ministry, is to filter the hearts and expose the hearts by means of these obstacles that he places in front of people. And that's his method of revealing himself. And because he's very wise, and he knows that if he were to, it's the same thing that Jesus said to the Pharisees, because you claim to see, you are blind. But if you knew you were blind, then you would see. The point there is, because you think you know something, you don't know anything. But if you approached and heard my riddles with humility, rather than scoffing, you would actually learn something, because you would dig and meditate, because you treasure those words, and you're able to find the divine reality on the other side of that. And this is the way Jesus taught concerning everything. And Jesus commanded even those who were healed not to even share the news with anyone. For what purpose? Why would, it's not just some reverse psychology because he knew that would result in them. No, it's because he was actually trying to conceal himself in that time and in that season. And this is why, to answer another objection of Alex, this is why the Gospel of John differs so greatly and is more obvious in its claims of deity than the Gnostics. Not because it's actually more prominent in John. It's not. In fact, the Synoptic Gospels have just as much of Jesus being presented as God as John. However, unfortunately, we just have lost the eyes to see it because we read everything on the surface and we don't know the scriptures enough to see the theology that is being developed and communicated, as I just demonstrated in Matthew 18. We just read over that, we don't even hear the echoes or recognize and discern the fact that Jesus is actually claiming there to be God. And this is just one example, there are many other examples, but this is the one I had prepared, leading up to this debate that I wasn't able to share. But I'll go into some of the other examples that were brought up by the Christians, and I'll go into just all of the juicy sort of details that took place during that recording. So I'll do that in the stream next week. If you like what you're seeing, please join the community and tune in. And I also have my streams in podcast format everywhere that podcasts are available, Spotify, Apple, etc., etc. So you can find me if you look for Deeb Thoughts, or you can just go to my website, deebthoughts.com, and see and find all the links there. Also, I'm going to be releasing an Ezekiel devotional soon. This is a devotional that goes through the book of Ezekiel, and these are just very short entries, one per chapter. There is, the names of God, the redemptive names of God. You have, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Rapha, Jehovah Tzidkenu, Jehovah Shalom, and so on. People are familiar with these redemptive names of God. However, there is a name that you do not hear. I've never heard of it, but it is a name of God that is in the book of Ezekiel, and it is revealed in the book of Ezekiel. I can give it to you now, but of course then you won't get the book. I'm just kidding. No, it is the Lord who strikes. This is the name in the same construction as the others. So in this devotional, I dive into the wrath of God and why it is actually beautiful. And I invite us to embrace even the terror of God. What you'll discover to your surprise is that you will find His love hidden in His wrath. You'll find His salvation hidden in His judgment, and you will find His rest hidden in His burden. So if that sounds like a journey that you want to take and you want a guide along the way, then my book is available. You can pick it up at my website, deebthoughts.com, and it'll be available very, very soon. You can pre-order it from the link on the website, and I appreciate your guys' support. Stay tuned. We'll see you next week. Please come to the stream so that I can answer your questions and react to everything live. It'll be fun. So we'll see you then.